Zando Penguin Audio presents The War of the Roses by Warren Adler, narrated by John Chancer.
Chapter 1. Jonathan Rose sat on an aisle seat, a few rows back from the podium, his long legs stretched out on the battered wood floor. The parlor was less than half full, no more than 30 people. Behind the auctioneer, strewn around like the aftermath of a bombing, were the assorted possessions of the family Barker, the last of whom had lived long enough to make some of the junk valuable. "It's a genuine Boston rocker," the auctioneer droned, his voice cracked and pleading as he pointed to a much-abused Windsor-style rocking chair. "Made by Hitchcock, Alford & Co., one of the finest names in chairs." He looked lugubriously around the silent room, no longer expectant. "Damn!" he snapped. "It's a genuine antique." $10, a lady's voice cackled. She was sitting in the front row, bundled in a dirty Irish sweater. $10, the auctioneer protested. "Look at the tapered back spindles, the scrolled top rail, the shaped seat." "All right, $12.50, the lady huffed. She had been buying most of the furniture offered, and to Jonathan it seemed like the auction was being held solely for her benefit. "This whole thing stinks," a voice hissed. It came from a veined Yankee face beside him. "The rain's mucked it all up. She's got the antique store in Provincetown. She'll get it for next to nothing, and sell it off to the tourists for 10 times as much." Jonathan nodded, clicking his tongue in agreement, knowing that the rain was his ally as well. Most of the tourists who had crowded into Chatham on Thursday and Friday, hoping for a pleasant Memorial Day weekend at the beach, had left by mid-morning. At the Breaking Wave, where Jonathan was a summer waiter, the dining room for the Sunday lunch looked and felt like an off-season resort, and his tips matched the mood. But the weather on Cape Cod was, at best, uncertain. He was used to it. All through undergraduate school at Harvard, he had worked summers at the Breaking Wave, amusing himself at the antique auctions on those days he couldn't get to the beach. He was especially fond of estate sales, held at old cottages once the owners had died. Rarely could he afford to buy anything, although occasionally he picked up a Staffordshire figure for a song. He had grown up being watched over by 4 Staffordshire pearl-ware female figurines, representing the 4 seasons garbed in décolleté white robes. They peered out of his mother's dining room china cabinet, emblems of his father's war service in England. Once he had broken spring, while removing the objet in a clandestine pre-puberty compulsion to feel the little lady's tits. The figure had slipped out of his grasp and was decapitated on the floor. Always good with his hands, Jonathan had done a magnificent glue job, and his mother was none the wiser. Over time, as if out of guilt, he had acquired a modest Staffordshire collection of his own, some sleeping child figures, and the more commonly found sailor with his wife and child. He had done a bit of research on Staffordshire pottery as well, and although his figures were comparatively cheap, he suspected that they would increase in value some day. The auctioneer reached for a figure representing a boxer and held it above his head. Then he read from the spec sheet. "Staffordshire pearlware, the pugilist Cribb, champion of England in 1809. Jonathan stiffened. The figure of Cribb was white. There was a black figure as well, of the boxer Molyneux, an ex-slave who had fought Cribb twice, losing both times. Both pugilists had been immortalized in caricature drawings, on pottery, and through figures like these. They were always depicted together, facing each other, fists raised. The idiot is breaking the pair, he thought, appalled by the auctioneer's ignorance. $15, the lady in the first row shouted. The auctioneer looked at the figure and shrugged. Jonathan knew it wasn't a work of art, merely souvenir quality, which probably sold for tuppence when first made by some anonymous backstreet potter. The auctioneer glared contemptuously at the audience, obviously wanting to hurry the sale. "I have 15, he croaked. "Going at 15, do I hear 16? Jonathan raised his hand. "I have 16, the man said, showing a sliver of optimism. The lady in the dirty Irish sweater turned in her chair. Her face looked like soggy dough, her red-tipped nose runny. 17, she cackled. "I have 17, the auctioneer said, his eyes shifting back to Jonathan. Jonathan raised 8 fingers, clearing his throat as well. The heavy woman huffed and shifted in her chair. Reaching into his pocket, he nervously pulled out his money. He had $37, his total weekend tip income. If he got crib, he wanted to have some left for Molyneux. 19, the lady boomed out. A gust of rain spattered against the windows. The auctioneer ignored it, warming to his task. Jonathan's heart pounded. "Bitch," he muttered, before shouting, 20. "Idiot," the woman rebuked, turning to fix on him her gaze of utter contempt. "I have 20. 20 once." A thin smile of satisfaction grew on the auctioneer's lips as he looked at the woman. He raised the gavel. 20 twice? Jonathan held his breath. Down went the gavel. "Sold." "God damn," Jonathan muttered, energized by the experience, savoring the flush of victory. "Well, you beat the old cow," the Yankee beside him twanged. Molyneux was brought forward a few moments later. Jonathan felt his guts tighten. "It's a pair," he told himself, pumping up his resolution. He peeled off what he had spent on crib and tucked the money safely in his pocket, clutching the remaining bills in a sweaty hand. There were only $17 left. "This is another Staffordshire pugilist, the fighter Molyneux, a former slave, who boxed in England in the early 19th century. $10, the lady in the dirty Irish sweater shouted. She did not turn to look behind her. Jonathan shouted out, 11. "Please," he begged in his mind, sensing surrender to his own determination. He had no business squandering his money. 12, a voice chirped from behind him. He turned quickly, startled by this new sound. 2 rows down, a girl with long chestnut hair flowing from under a sailor cap smiled primly, a flush on her apple-contoured cheekbones. "Shit," Jonathan mumbled, as the auctioneer responded. "I have 12. $12.50, the girl responded without hesitation. "Don't they know it's a pair?" Jonathan whispered to himself, as if her bids were a form of vengeance. He held up his fist, in which he clutched the sweaty bills. "I have 13, the auctioneer called, staring directly at the girl. She's hesitating, Jonathan thought. "Do I hear 13.50? "I have 50, 13.50, the auctioneer declared. Jonathan was sure the auctioneer was playing games. Jonathan scowled at him, then turned and rebuked the girl with his eyes. 14, he growled. His throat was tightening. He felt the tension in his stomach. "Damned bitch," he cried inside himself. It made no sense at all to break up the pair. The auctioneer looked toward the girl. "I have 15, the auctioneer announced. The audience grew restless. 16, Jonathan croaked. 17, the girl responded quickly, her voice carrying over the din. "It's a damned pair," Jonathan yelled, shaking his head. He opened his palm and unrolled the bills. 17. That was it. Not even additional change. He turned again and looked at the girl. She was calm, almost serene, but there was no mistaking her determination. "I have 17, the auctioneer said, staring at Jonathan, his glare intimidating. 18! Jonathan shouted, his voice crackling.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?